Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the B2B Revenue Leadership Podcast. Hey, it's another year, another time to make some more money, and I've got the course for you. Start the Conversation, Get the Meeting will help your team, both business development, sales development, get into those new cold accounts, whether that function is under marketing or sales. I'll help you with that by starting organic, natural conversations, not pitching. Have people open up with you, build up a connection with them, understand your total addressable market, prioritize it, and put in a system that scales, that's predictable, that works the way you want it to work instead of the old school pitch. Believe me, I've sat through so many of these cold calling seminars, courses, books, and I've been doing it for 30 years, and it's evolved. And what I'm doing today is what's working in today's world. It works naturally, and people are just loving it, getting meetings, closing deals, and doing it without the rejection that is typically there in sales. So check it out at b2brevenue.com under the training tab. You can schedule a call with me. We can talk it over. I'll explain how it works and how we can work together on it. You can buy it per student, or I'll customize it for your particular product and team and coach you through that process. Also, if you're a sales leader and you want predictability, you want direction, momentum, and control with your deals, you can sign up for that course as well. Same type of model. A year-long access to it. It's content, community, and coaching, all included at b2brevenue.com. You can get my free ebook there on how companies make product selections. That's all free. Let's get into the interview, but I want to make sure you're checking out my partners. They're in the show notes. This week, it's Pipedrive and Covideo. Pipedrive is the new CRM. It's been out for 5 years. I've been using it forever. I love that. It's connected up with your email, your calendar, and now they have team capabilities. Covideo is the video email system. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's the way to break into new accounts. It's so much more engaging than text. Check them out. Also, make sure you're checking me out on LinkedIn, Brian G. Burns on LinkedIn. Let's get into the interview. I'll sum it up at the end. Hey, Joe, thanks for joining us today. As a way of getting started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm originally from South Africa, so we can get the accent, squared away. You're thinking Australia, New Zealand, England. And I came to the U.S. 22 years ago, worked for a number of Madison Avenue agencies, but somehow escaped. And since 2002, I've been consulting, and I've been fortunate enough to write now 5 books and currently running my 3rd company. So, really focused on, I would say if there are common threads, it's change, it's creativity, it's innovation. And oftentimes I think a lot of my writing and my thinking is about, it's kind of like a Robin Hood approach from an optimization. It's always trying to take money from the rich and give to the poor, or in this case, reallocating or optimizing budgets to what I think is a much more worthy investment or area. And of course, the top of that list will always be from acquisition to retention.
And what was your motivation to write this book, Built to Suck? I mean, I love the title. But what does it mean to you?
So Built to Suck comes from 2 different, angles. One was Jay Chiat, the founder of TBWA Chiat Day, which is the last company that I actually worked for, had a saying, let's see how big we get before we go bad, before we suck. And that juxtaposed with Jim Collins' fantastic book, right? He wrote Good to Great and he wrote Built to Last. And the reality is that many companies on that list are struggling right now. In fact, many of them have not been built to last. Just to be clear, that doesn't, I pay homage to Jim and to the book. And he says, companies are not visionary companies forever. Just because you are one doesn't mean you will stay one. My thesis is that the business model of big business is broken, that companies today, big corporations, have become too big, too lethargic, too political, too siloed, too risk averse. They're essentially slowing down when the world is speeding up, and they've lost their competitive edge. And I actually think that, I talk about the fifth industrial revolution, which is really the entrepreneurial revolution. We are living through a time right now where we're seeing major upheaval and disruption, and it is impacting businesses and business models and entire verticals, entire industries. And we can see it all around us. And I'm kind of like reflecting on that, both anecdotally and empirically, and saying, survival right now is not a guarantee unless certain dramatic steps are taken. And even if those steps are taken, it just may not be enough. It may be too little too late for the corporate empire or the corporate era.
And what do you think the cause of that is? The cause of it going to the sock instead of the last?
Well, so the backdrop maybe, and I actually am racking my brain because I cannot remember what the initial spark was for this book. But I do know that about 4 years ago, I went into my daughter's classroom at school, and I saw this map of 5,000 years of history. And it actually was depicting the rise and fall, essentially, of the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, Nazi Germany. Like every empire or civilization had risen and fallen. And I thought to myself, well, wait a second. Why do we believe somehow that this corporate empire will be any different? Why do we believe that if we did, in fact, look at corporations as a civilization, why do we believe that the same rot, the same bad habits, hubris, arrogance, short-term thinking will not ultimately become its demise? And so I reference what I call the corporate apocalypse, and every good apocalypse needs 4 horsemen. And so the 4 horsemen, to answer your question, are, number one is size, that scale, economies of scale, efficiencies of scale, like the very thing that helped these companies grow is now killing them. The second one being age, and I use the benchmark of a millennial company has a stay of execution, so any company born in 1980 or more recent. The third being a public company, which I think is the kiss of death. It is, I say kind of tongue-in-cheek, it's a CTD, a corporate transmitted disease called short-termitis. And I think once companies are sucked into those quarterly earnings and quarterly expectations, they are unable to think bigger and act bigger and more long term. And then the fourth is culture. And I think if you kind of combine those 4 ingredients, it is a lethal and deadly cocktail that is almost impossible to somehow, you can't just take an antidote and hope to be okay on the other end.
And do you see it more than just you have that charismatic or leader? We have Jobs, Bezos, Ellison, whoever, who has a true north and only cares about that and will cut through all that BS.
So I was ironically listening to Jim Collins being interviewed on Tim Ferriss's podcast, and really great conversation and back and forwards there about is leadership in fact a differentiator between the visionary company and the non-visionary company, and Collins's argument was it isn't, because there have been visionary leaders, or at least great leaders, in companies that have sucked and gone bad and struggled, and there have been maybe average leaders in some of the companies that have done very well. What he does is he goes a little bit further, and he talks about a level 5 characteristic, which is a humility associated with the great leader. So the two of them working together. But I do believe that leaders and visionary leaders are in short supply. It is part of the reason why I think Elon Musk had his in air quotes, his nervous breakdown and his kind of Twitter brain fart, because they don't, there are few, when you think about really exceptional people living today, they are so few and far between. We can't understand them. We can't get into their minds or even walk a mile in their moccasins. but we've got to respect them and respect how different they are, and how exceptional they are. It's one of those things which is, you may not agree with their point of view, but certainly you will respect them for having it. And so I have to believe that leadership and great leaders are, they might not be the factor, but they certainly help elevate and separate. But of course, the counter argument to that is, you've got to be able to lead by example. You've got to be able to delegate, and you've got to be able to create, scalability and continuity that goes beyond the leader. I would say, and certainly I studied this quite a bit, which is what really needs to happen in organizations is empowerment and autonomy, and that whole classic example of, I'd rather beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. It's what comes out of one of the pillars that I wrote about, which is talent resurrection, which is, we should be able to see leadership even, from our interns, even from the kids of the C-suite that come to work. We should be able to find and extract and celebrate all forms of leadership, but recognizing that leadership will look a little different in an entry-level person versus someone in the boardroom. And it is that skill, and it is a skill that I think could make a huge difference.
Well, you certainly see that. I know you're a big fan of Apple and the Apple Store. It's like they are empowered to do the right thing instead of fitting into the corporate process.
Yeah, I mean, Apple is a great example because, I use the very simple analogy of, this is a time when companies in increasing amounts are closing down bricks and mortar stores and firing humans, letting humans go in favor of AI, whatever the hell that means, right? In favor of automation, in favor of moving people to digital, where they can avoid talking to humans. And what is Apple doing, right? They've bought prime real estate, Grand Central, the Louvre. And I kind of say this somewhat tongue in cheek, but I dare you to try and walk from one side of an Apple store to the other without being like rugby tackled by one of their geniuses or one of their their kind of employees. We'll, I'm sure, come back to that in a moment. The word employee is a trigger word as well. But I like the idea of exemplifying a company that, that swims upstream or cuts against the grain, because true creativity and originality and disruption has to, by definition, be an exception to the norm. Otherwise, if everybody's doing it, how on earth is it going to separate itself? And that's what of many things, amongst many things, that's what Apple's doing. And I will say one more thing is, they're also smart because they also recognize sometimes people don't want to talk to human beings. So you can walk in, you can scan your AirPods or whatever you want to buy with your Apple, with your app, and walk straight out. You can essentially check yourself out. Yeah, and one day I'm going to try and experiment, but I'm going to have to get I'm going to have to figure out a way to do it without tipping my hand or Apple's hand. But I want to actually walk in and pretend to check myself out and walk out of the store and see if I'm caught.
Oh, you will be. You ever wonder how they know who you are in the queue without you ever meeting the people?
That's what I want to figure out, because part of the the exercise is essentially an exercise in trust. It's so funny because I cite an example, a guy by the name of Len Hauser, who I met years and years ago at South by Southwest, and he said, there are two types of people, numerator people and denominator people. And I just got it in a second, right? The numerator people are all about the upside, limitless upside, and the denominator people are just trying to mitigate the downside and cost cut, etc. And I think that, even when you think about theft, right, and shoplifting, or more importantly, let's think about churn and attrition. And customer defection, that's much more significant. When we start looking at all of that as acceptable numbers, right, as defaults, as rounding errors, or we're looking at it just in terms of numbers, and stripped out the humanity, we've basically lost. But when there's an element of actually humanity inside it, that's when we win. And so a company that says, look, we accept the fact that there are going to be some people that are going to walk out of our store without actually, trying to cheat the system. But we accept, but there's a certain acceptable amount of wiggle room that says we're building an ecosystem that is based on respect and trust and ultimately being a part of this family. That may sound incredibly ephemeral and unrealistic and a little bit naive, but that's at least, you spoke about a true north. That is a true north that actually says we may never get there, but at least we're moving in the right direction.
Well, I mean, we saw that with Howard Schultz and Starbucks, where, even with, and I happen to live in an urban area, and there's homeless people in the Starbucks. And it as a customer, you don't like it, but as a company, they just put the stake in the ground, and anyone can come into the store, use the facilities without buying anything.
Yeah, I mean, and you know what? It's funny because Starbucks have gone through little iterations of that. The big challenge, and I actually started my career. I started out my career working for a fast food chicken company, so I know a lot about. Yeah, I mean, bizarre, right? I know a lot about like the franchise and quality control and standardization, and each store is a little different, but you've got to try and figure out, at least from a cultural standpoint, a way to replicate and at least create that consistency. And I think that, in some Starbucks I'd noticed years ago, and even some of my previous books, they were covering up the plugs. And it was just a horrible sign saying, we don't want you to charge and linger, etc. But for the most part, I think Starbucks has moved away from that, and that might have been more of an anomaly where a certain operator might have been a little bit more rogue. But yeah, you'll still see Starbucks that have codes on the door, on the bathroom door, and it's like the equivalent of how many times have you gone into a hotel and the hangers are like, those hangers that you can't remove. And it's like, seriously, if you don't trust your customer enough, to kind of like that you're worried they're stealing your hangers, you got much bigger problems. And so I think, again, even with the Starbucks, you want to see, and I go into that into detail in terms of creating a little case study of Starbucks in the book. But of course, they had a terrible incident where, 2 African Americans were essentially arrested, and they were customers just because for whatever reason, the operator or the manager in that store, clearly had gone a little bit insane, and a little bit racist. And so what did Starbucks do? They weren't offensive. They didn't, just try and put all the focus on that one bad egg. They essentially closed every one of their stores, and as you know, and they conducted sensitivity training one day across every one of their stores in the U.S. And I mean, that is, sure, there were skeptical people and cynical people that kind of looked at that as PR or didn't. But come on, which company would actually go to that nth degree to overcorrect against something that, quite frankly, you just know was not sanctioned by corporate, clearly was not sanctioned by corporate? That's the kind of decisiveness and commitment to customers, what I call customer obsession, that companies have got to be able to, whether they're B2B or B2C companies, in order to survive.
Now, can you give us a B2B example that either you've worked with or you observed that it's really crushing it in that area?
So, when you look at B2B, the best way to from a category standpoint, I mean, there are many examples today where you see, and I've cited these examples even before I wrote Built to Suck, whether it's MailChimp and their talent resurrection, how they absolutely, how they've used brilliantly Instagram, to demonstrate the culture in the company and how committed committed their employees are to the cause, or IBM and likewise what they've done with their employees. The whole idea of the view from my office, demonstrating their how global they are, and how so many of their employees, how diverse their employees are, and all the different places they work from. But ultimately, it is this now this whole thrust towards account-based marketing, and specifically what I would call flipping the funnel, that I think demonstrates a certain commitment to being able to recognize that, guess what? In B2B, much more so than B2C, it is 4 or 5 customers, or certainly it is 10% of your customers that are responsible for well over 50% of your revenue, more like 70 or 80% of your revenue. And so companies that are doing that and feeding that advocacy, the Hootsuites of the world, we've seen companies separate themselves by not just being customer obsessed, but doing it from a disproportionate vantage point, recognizing, what, it is an absolute fool's errand to say, well, we don't need to invest in our most profitable or most loyal customers, because it's not like they're going to spend any more money with us. It's not like we've got them already as customers. Let's rather just focus on what I call strangers and prostitutes, right? The first time buyer and the switcher. And I mean, and so it's really I've always felt that B2B, people always go, well, that's, you spoke about Coke, or you spoke about Nike, or you spoke about Starbucks, but B2B has always been so much more, I think, of a low-hanging fruit for any and all of this thinking, from digital through social, through mobile, through emerging technology, through all of this whole world, simply because there's always an element of personal selling and humanity, or at least should be, right? When everything moves to the automated web-based, system, that's when a certain red flag goes off, unless there just is such a sublime, UI or UX, or app, or ability to kind of service a customer in a way that you actually don't need the human element. It's the cherry on top as opposed to the foundation.
Yeah, and I have seen that, where it's kind of like Pareto's principle recursively, where it's like, oh, you get 80% of your revenue from 20% of your clients, and then you get 40% from 10 and 20 from 5%. And all of a sudden, there is a very small number of key accounts that generate a huge amount of revenue, yet they go marketing to everybody like they're all the same.
Yeah, and the idea behind flip the funnel, and I'll kind of give it a built to suck spin as well, but is how to use existing customers to gain new ones. And there is a kind of a Maslowian hierarchy that actually says, first of all, we should stop referring to retention from a corporate centric standpoint. And what I mean by that is, even when we classify retention dollars, what we're talking about is cross-sell, upsell, churn, attrition, competitive conquesting. We're basically still talking about us, but it's when you get into content creation, community, joining the conversation, referral based or affiliate based, and then the ultimate is what I call kind of ownership, right? The self-actualization phase, which is when your customers are in fact owners, like they actually own stock or equity or are part of the R&D or innovation engine. You're actually tapping into them. They're advisors to the company. That's true retention, and that's when you actually see something that can separate, right? And so from a built to suck standpoint, what's happened again is, with size, with age, with being a public company, and with this culture, this almost rot. It's a rot that sets in, but it's also a forgetfulness. Companies forget where they've come from. They're all in search of purpose today. And my answer is no, don't search for your purpose. Just remember it, right? You didn't get to where you got to without a purpose. Yeah. But somehow along the way, you lost your way and you lost your edge. And you got too focused on the wrong things. Your prioritization got completely, turned on its head. So in a way, like part of this message is, isn't survival is about as primal as you could ever, imagine. So it's almost like, let's get back to basics, right? This is not a different message to even the point about customer service, right? Treat people, it's very biblical even, right? Treat people the way you would want to be treated back in return. And so, but of course, when the stakes are about survival, kill or be killed, you can't just, it's not just a kumbaya here. It's all hands on deck.
I think that's the biggest cause of all is, what now is I've kind of learned is the inner mindset versus the outer mindset, where the inner mindset is the malignant, the lizard brain looking out for the individual survival. And until that is calmed and comforted, they don't look outside of themselves.
Yeah, and no, it's a great point, and actually, one of the things that I start to touch on, and I've developed quite a bit of thinking around it, is this idea of, people talk about developing the marketing muscle, but survival is not a muscle; it's an instinct. And so yes. I talk about kind of crafting and honing and sharpening the survival instinct, which itself is based on either self-preservation, which is don't kill me, or adaptation, which is I'm going to kill you. and so I'm actually I've been fortunate enough to realize many bucket list items professionally. One of them is writing a book, and now I've written 5, and the other one is becoming a professor. And so I'm currently teaching. I've written and I'm teaching a course at West Virginia University's Reed College of Media, and my students actually have to pick a death watch company. So they've picked like JCPenney, they've picked Victoria's Secret. It's so interesting. Mattress Firm, GNC. It's so amazing to watch the stuff. And they've got to develop a survival plan and a growth plan as part of their final report. Now, part of this idea in terms of helping them understand the survival instinct is this idea of, with self-preservation, you run away from the danger, right? If there's a forest fire, you don't run into the fire, you run away from it. But with adaptation, you run to the danger. And so whereas self-preservation is about fear and pain, adaptation is about hunger and risk. And so the analogy I draw is, if you are a lion that hasn't eaten in 3 days, or you will throw all caution to the wind. You will leap an electric fence. You will attack a ranger or a hunter with a gun. You will literally go to the danger because the stakes are that high. And I wonder why enough companies don't recognize that they are in survival mode. It's the boiling frog syndrome. Are they truly so comfortable? How can anyone be comfortable today? So clearly it's not that they're comfortable. So what is it? Is it denial? Is it hubris or arrogance? Is it just debilitating fear? I mean, I don't know what you think in terms of the companies that you see out there.
I think a psychiatrist, and I've studied this quite a bit, that people don't change because even the misery of today is more comfortable than the pleasure of tomorrow. That even the simplest of changes, of minimum of effort, of touching your ear, they will not do because they're more comfortable in the misery they have today. This is why, people marry abusers, marry known alcoholics, because they were raised by them, that they're comfortable with it. And I think certainly in big companies, the Sears, the JCPenney's, that people hold on for their pensions. They play the game. I've been in those big companies, and you just see the soldiers, every smiling and nodding. They don't believe it. They're all just go off in their car and drive away. I think that's why I keep coming back to the leadership thing, because when I've seen the leader there and they cut through all the bureaucracy, And the true north, regardless, and you hear the story about the turnaround of Ford, where they had the red, green, and yellow. I don't know if you know that story. But everyone came in with green. Green mean everything was on schedule. Yet nothing was being delivered.
Well, the things you say make me think of two different connections. One is, and I talk about the GE case study where, there was this whole success theater that had been created, this culture from the top, from the chairman, where people could only come with good news and talk about good news. And it was insane, right? So they were almost in denial, because of such a fragile ego that God forbid should be, dented. But the other thing, what you were saying about the pleasure, the pleasure and pain, I talk about that a lot. And, entrepreneurs are masochists, and corporate executives need to be more masochistic. They're too sadistic. They need to be more masochistic. They need to really love pain, because that is what motivates a true entrepreneur that is constantly being told no, that is constantly failing and pivoting and learning from their mistakes. And so, there's the old saying, right, which is change happens when the pain of not changing is greater than the pain of changing.
Yes.
So there's pain both ways. But if you can't tolerate any form of pain, you're basically doomed.
Yeah. Now, what will people get out of the book, or what do you hope they get out of the book?
Well, I think that the book offers maybe three different levels. The first is being able to almost take a step back and reflect and really kind of have this picture painted about this hypothesis, right, about the demise of the corporation, and really go into it. And I believe it's a fascinating account and read, just being able to recognize where we are, the snapshot in time, and be able to bring that to life, both anecdotally and empirically. Then there is the kind of middle ground. So in classic compartments, right? You've got the problem, which I just outlined. Then before the solution, there is this idea of maybe the best chapter I've ever written, which is this whole idea of what's your heresy? Embrace your heresy to define your legacy. I've come up with these 10 ridiculously almost counterintuitive heresies. Like, what if you funded your competitor? What if you slaughtered the cash cow? What if you gave away your product for free and still no one wanted it? That's called the newspaper industry. What if you left money on the table? What if you got out of the very business that you were in, right? Which is like Barnes & Noble stopped selling books. Well, guess what Amazon did? They didn't stop, but they, do people think of Amazon as a bookseller today, an online bookseller? And to me, that is the idea of embracing your inner heretic is something that is such a meaty, philosophical and academic, and yet practical and pragmatic approach you can apply to any aspect of your life, which is if you're prepared to embrace, or at least look at yourself in the mirror and embrace your deepest, darkest fear, it is the most cathartic and liberating release of all. And then, of course, the third part of the book gets into the 4 pillars: the digital disruption, customer obsession, talent resurrection, and corporate citizenship. And then, of course, at the end, the survival planning canvas, which I'm very, very proud of, a la Lean Startup and all of these one-page, business planning canvases. This one is a survival planning canvas, and it is a great way for companies to, capture all of this thinking, the heresy, the legacy, the walking the plank, the discovering new worlds, the adopting new business models and revenue streams, and having it all on one page for them to stick up on the wall and figure out how to bring to life. So, the book does offer a way forward, but the subhead of the book, it ends with a question mark: the inevitable demise of the corporation and how to save it, with a question mark. Because my belief is it may really, really be too little too late for the corporate empire, because they just, you can, the analogy I use is you can give them the goose that laid the golden egg, and they would slaughter it and cook it and eat it on barbecue. And he'd be like, no, guys, this wasn't a one-time use. So, yeah, in many respects, this is about human nature. I mean, if we've seen history, it repeats itself again and again and again, and we don't learn our lessons from the past. We've never figured out how to be more creative on the Super Bowl. We just get worse. We've never figured out how to truly be digitally disruptive. We're so much more focused on the programmatic and the automated and the direct response aspect of digital as opposed to changing the game. And so, it remains to be seen whether there will be, to your point earlier, enough leaders that stand up, that stick their necks out, that raise their hands, that step forward and say, we're prepared to take these dramatic steps because the stakes are so high. And so I think anyone reading the book, I often say, if you're a Goliath, well, this book will, hopefully help you either create a stay of execution or even somehow figure out how to be that phoenix, right, that's reborn. And if you're a David looking to take out the Goliath, well, this kind of gives you the blueprint, but most importantly, will prevent you from becoming that Goliath, because every single company has. And I kind of, 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the book went to print, Jeff Bezos called this all-hands meeting, and he said to all of his employees, this was just after they'd awarded their new headquarters, he said, one day we will fail. One day we will go bankrupt. Your job is to delay that for as long as possible. And I thought to myself, wow, if he can say that about Amazon, please show me any company on this planet that is somehow, less, or I should say somehow more immune to all of these forces.
Cool. Hey, this has been a great conversation. Where would you like people to connect with you?
Well, they can, I'm pretty much Jaffe Juice on all channels, social media channels. But if you want to find out more about the book, you can go to builttosuck.com or, of course, find it on Amazon. And if you want to find out more about the HMS Beagle, which is my strategic consultancy where we actually help our clients navigate the journey to survival, that URL is thehmsbeagle.com.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that interview. Hey, I want to make sure you're checking out b2brevenue.com. That is where you can get a free copy of an ebook that I did. It's a real ebook. It's not a fluff book. It shows and talks about how companies make buying decisions and how you can influence that from both a marketing and a sales standpoint, how to find all the people that are in the decision path and what they need to see, know, and touch and feel before they make a product selection. If your team needs some coaching, some help, some training, some systems, some processes that do work today, because we know what doesn't work, or what doesn't work, I'll show you what does work and how to connect and get into pretty much any account. It includes deal coaching and content, community, and I can customize it for your particular company. Just go to b2brevenue.com, look under training, schedule a call with me. We can talk it over, or just sign up. You can pay per month or all at once, whichever makes most sense for your budget. Also, I put out videos pretty much daily on LinkedIn and on YouTube. On LinkedIn, it's Brian G. Burns, and on YouTube, it's Brian Burns Sales. Just search for that if you like to consume some video content. And if you see me on LinkedIn, please put a comment and a share and a like on some of the videos. I really appreciate it. I've got a company page for each podcast. This one, the B2B Revenue Leadership Podcast, where I put both content and humor videos out daily. And tell a friend about the podcast. Really appreciate you listening. Check out the show notes for all the partners and the connections you can make there, the coupon codes for the products to evaluate them, see if they're a right match for you. And we'll see you next time.